Thank you. Administration, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Tunse, Awashde, Atitu. Greetings and good morning. This morning, this will be a bit of a team presentation. I'm very pleased to be here this morning to share the City of Edmonton's Indigenous framework. The framework as we present it today is a testament to many years of working to understand our relationships and responsibilities as a city and treaty people. By accepting this report for information, you are launching this framework for the City of Edmonton to adopt and to implement. Once it is safe to do so, we will have a ceremony and celebration of this framework and the work behind it. This framework is intended to answer the question, how can the City of Edmonton best support and build strong relationships with Indigenous peoples in Edmonton? This framework is a living document representing our formal and informal relationships with elders, knowledge keepers, Indigenous youth, as well as partners, institutional and agency partners. It also includes the wealth information shared from research and many discussions with municipal and community leaders and members, service providers, and academic professionals. I'd like to acknowledge our elders, youth partners, who have gathered with us this morning. Without your guidance and input, this framework would not have been possible. I recently had the privilege of attending along with the executive leadership team and our elders to review the Indigenous framework. There was incredible passion in the room for creating the relationships to fully activate the framework, and commitment to a partnership that will make life in Edmonton more equitable and fulfilling. This is the beginning of a journey of discovery, learning, and adapting. This is the beginning for this administration that will take an ongoing engagement and empathy, and with the framework to guide us, we are ready to build a community in which Indigenous people can see themselves reflected in our spaces, places, and programs. I'll now ask Ms. Owen to make some comments.
It's now my honour to underscore the land acknowledgement that Councillor Paquette has already made at the onset of this committee meeting. We reference this land acknowledgement at the beginning of our city meetings, not only as a sign of deep respect, but also as a sincere thank you. We are all privileged and honoured to be living in this very special and sacred place, a place which has millennia of history and a long-standing welcoming spirit. When I came here in 1984 from the UK, I was welcomed with open arms by every Canadian I came across. And I think they learned that tradition of warmth from the first peoples who welcomed their ancestors to this remarkable piece of geography. As Mr. Kobold mentioned, I have been fortunate to be a part of the ELT discussions with a number of elders, and I have been struck by how much laughter there is when we connect. It has reminded me that while reconciliation is serious work and critical to a healthier city, it can also be infused with joy, learning from one another, being vulnerable, laughing together, leading with heart. That has been and will continue to be a real pleasure. One of the critical lessons that the city received from Indigenous elders along this journey has been the importance of seeking their guidance and their wisdom. When this initiative began, we applied a conventional corporate approach to our planning, as you might expect. But it quickly became evident that we needed to find a balance between following established city processes and applying an Indigenous approach to this work. In the spirit of applying Indigenous approaches, we worked with experts at the U of A, including Dr. Lana Whiskeyjack, who is here with us today. Over to you, Dr. Whiskeyjack.
Hi, Tanzikakia Nawagamaganak, Lana Whiskeyjack Nitsigasan, Onyx Koponikotsinia. Musquatwachi Waskaigan is where I created my home for my family. and I work at the University of Alberta as an assistant professor. I give great gratitude to be here today on this beautiful land that our ancestors signed treaty to share. And I'm grateful to the many servant leaders and support who moved the Indigenous framework to value the guidance of our beloved elders and restore spirit in building and strengthening relations within our ceremonial ways. My esteemed colleague, Dr. Faye Fletcher, and I were invited by the Indigenous Framework team to give guidance and support in moving the Indigenous framework within Indigenous ways of knowing and being. I was also one of the 4 artists who joined the community gatherings, visually responding to the city as witness. I give great gratitude to the lessons of this critical work. As an Isinio Otaski, a human of this land, I have always heard our Kiteiayak, our wise, precious knowledge keepers, elders, and leaders say in Nehiawewin, the Cree language, that the languages of this land, that our language is spirit and our words are medicine. And our words carry powerful, lasting impacts of the present and future. This framework, grounded in ceremony, language, and the spirit of Kitaiayak and Isiniwak, the peoples of this land, is vitally important to, 1, to correct the past wrongs from internal and external racism that have had traumatic, lasting impacts on the way Isiniwak have been treated and viewed within our city. And 2, to return to the original intentions of the treaty from an Isiniwak worldview, to be a whole human being and sharing and helping one another, abiding by the laws of this land, such as truth, sharing, kindness, and courage, and to build and strengthen Wakotowin, kinship systems, to value one another as relatives, to treat each other as you would your grandparents, your grandchildren, and your little siblings. It made me incredibly grateful to be part of this Edmonton commitment as the team members walked with good intentions, offering protocols to the many Indigenous community organizations, then offering protocol to each of the highly valued elders who sat in circle, generously sharing, reminding, and following with action the beautiful ways and teachings of this land. A name was gifted to this framework in ceremony led by Tom Snow and Teresa Cardinal. This name, Wahiji, gave spirit to the framework, animating it with life that must be nurtured and supported to grow and evolve the intention and visions of our Indigenous community and the city of Edmonton. This work began with spirit, igniting the spirit fires of all those involved through our sacred ceremonies, which we don't take for granted, of this land, so that our Siniwak may also create healthy, warm, loving homes for their families and strengthen our Edmonton community. Hi, hi.
Hi, Lana. Thank you very much for working with us and coming with us on this journey together of building good relations with the First Peoples of this land. And good morning, everyone. My name is Jamie Miller. I'm the Director of the Indigenous Relations Office here at the City of Edmonton. I am Métis through my father's family from Hastings Lake, Alberta, and St. Albert, and of course, Amiskwaciwâskahikan as well. And so I'm very humbled to be with you today to share this Indigenous framework. As part of our development process of building this framework, as Lana eloquently laid out for us, we needed to create an ethical space for engagement. Traditionally, community decision-making models, Indigenous community decision-making models, are based on the circle process, where everybody has a voice, everyone has gifts to bring to the circle, and that we respect that process of sharing. We focus on consensus building, sharing leadership, and sharing responsibility. And I think, to me, that is the biggest teaching from the elders, is that our relationships also come with our responsibilities to each other as kin. And so we worked closely with elders and knowledge keepers, with youth. They're the center of our circle. And we protect them, and they guide us in what our community needs. We also, of course, work closely with our community partners. The city can't act alone in any of this work, and we need to develop those partnerships and those respectful relations with each other to make a difference in people's lives. As Lana shared, our work was guided in ceremony. Tom Snow and Teresa Cardinal lifted their pipes for us, and Tom shared with us the word Wahigi Chichobi, or kinship, from the Nakota language. We also know about Wakotowin as well from the Nehio language. where we talk about our relationships and our responsibilities, not only to our immediate family, but to all of our family members, all of those people in our community, as well as the plants, the animals, Mother Earth, all of the things that we are in relationship with. And so in that spirit, we tried to work with as many partners and stakeholders and people in the community as that we could, because we know that making a difference in people's lives is going to take a collective lift. And so in this timeline you see before you here, we held elders gatherings, youth gatherings, as well as community engagement gatherings over the last while. So why do we need an Indigenous framework? Or why are we trying to change the hearts and minds of 13,000 City of Edmonton staff? Well, I think we have to ask ourselves, why is reconciliation important? Why do this work? And I can tell you about the statistics. I can tell you about issues that we've seen in our community, such as this weekend. I can give you all kinds of data, I guess, that demonstrate that Indigenous peoples have struggled because of colonization, because of historic trauma, the experience of residential schools in the 60s scoop, poverty, violence, all of these things. But I don't want to focus on those things. I want to focus on the strength and the resilience of the community. And that when community is empowered to make a difference in their lives, in the families and the children's lives, it results in better outcomes for everybody. And so I am really committed to working in partnership with Indigenous peoples in this city to make things better in our city, to make it a safe city, a welcoming city, a city where everybody can walk down the street and feel that this is their home. Because I've heard directly from Indigenous peoples, and particularly youth, that that doesn't always feel good here in Edmonton. We also know that there's been some transformational things happening in Canadian society over the last while. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, as well as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so all of these things have coalesced, and to me, it means that the time is right for the City of Edmonton to reconnect to building positive and respectful relations with Indigenous peoples. And so when we get into the Indigenous framework, you will see that we outline some general principles, 4 roles, and 7 commitments. And these 4 roles have gone through many different iterations. As you saw from the timeline slide, we had many different sessions where we sat and talked with people one-on-one, where we gathered with elders, youth, community members, and the 4 roles were shaped through all of those conversations. And so I'd like to share with you now the 4 roles that we're asking city staff to consider and to take on in their everyday work as city employees. So the first role is that of a listener. We listen with open hearts and minds when Indigenous people share their stories and experiences. Being a listener is the first step. It's opening your heart, opening your mind, being quiet and listening to people's truth. A connector, we connect Indigenous peoples to the programs, services, people, and resources that enrich the community and foster relationships to create positive change. We know that the City of Edmonton can't do everything, and so we work closely with our community partners, the orders of government, Indigenous nations, to provide those services, those programs, and those supports that our people need in Edmonton. Partner, we work in partnership with Indigenous peoples on initiatives to improve the physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional well-being of Indigenous peoples in Edmonton. Again, the best solutions come from community. They know what's needed, and so we work in partnership together to address these things. And of course, advocate. We stand with Indigenous peoples to create a safe and inclusive city where everybody is treated with dignity and respect.
Thank you, Jamie. Good morning, and thank you very much for honoring us today. My name is Ian Howitt, and I've had the distinct honor and privilege to co-lead with Jamie on this very important work Jamie introduced you to the 4 roles. We've also created 7 commitments to bring these 4 roles to life. This work is about changing individuals and the system. The 7 commitments are intended to shape the entire organization, programs, services, policies, culture. Each City of Edmonton department will be responsible for creating and implementing an action plan detailing how it will fulfill each of the following corporate-wide commitments. I'm going to spend a few minutes now going over each of these commitments in turn. First, support the journey of reconciliation by applying the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Calls for Justice, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a foundation for this Indigenous framework. 2, in partnership with organizations, businesses, academic institutions, other orders of government, and individual citizens, eliminate the systemic racism and discrimination that Indigenous peoples face in Edmonton. Next, identify and implement ways to make city spaces and buildings welcoming and safe for Indigenous peoples, and ensure they can see themselves reflected in the city's spaces and places. Number 4, support all city staff to build relationships that honor the framework's 4 roles within their interactions with Indigenous peoples, and increase staff's knowledge of Indigenous cultures, traditions, and worldviews through education and learning opportunities. 5, host and participate in events where the City of Edmonton, including council, senior leadership, and all levels of administration and Indigenous peoples, can build relationships and celebrate our journey together. Next, identify and remove the systemic barriers that exist for Indigenous peoples in gaining employment with the City of Edmonton, and create career development opportunities for Indigenous employees. And lastly, ensure Indigenous peoples and city staff are informed and engaged, when appropriate, on actions the City of Edmonton takes in relation to the Indigenous framework. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Smythe.
Thanks again. So what does this mean to me as a city employee? As a city, we've been on this journey for a number of years, starting to rebuild trust and understanding. This framework, as has been said, is a starting place. It's really a call to action for all 13,000 of us as public servants at the municipal level to create an integrated corporate-wide understanding of not only what our relationship with Indigenous community needs to look like, but importantly, how we need to demonstrate our accountability. Our actions need to match our desire for reconciliation. Presenters this morning, Andre, Catherine, Lana, Jamie, and Ian, each spoke to the wisdom and guidance we received from elders during the creation of the framework. And as both Andre and Catherine have said, as members of ELT, we had the privilege to gather virtually with elders and to be granted time to hear and reflect on their teachings. A bit of personal reflection. This is a journey of both learning and action for all of us who work for the city. From my personal journey, one teaching of the elders that I found very profound is the notion of two-eyed seeing. This is a concept from Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, where we view our environment and our community from both the Indigenous ways of knowing and seeing and through a Western way of knowing and seeing. So my learning journey, I try to think about my work differently and bring a two-eyed seeing approach to everything I do. I'm certainly not there yet. I found this way of knowing and seeing to be a very meaningful gift from the elders. So what we refer to now as action teams will bring the framework to life through the creation and implementation of department-specific and corporate-wide action plans that activate each of the 7 commitments that Ian reviewed. This work will also be supported by a corporate steering committee, which will work with the project sponsors to coordinate the overall corporate-wide implementation of the framework and to align knowledge, resources, and actions accordingly. While I certainly don't have time today to list off all of the names of the folks pictured here, I do want to draw attention to the assembly of faces on the slide. Pictured here are some of the members of our department action teams and project team who are already starting to live the roles and commitments of the framework. It's critical that we start to show up as allies so that our colleagues and the community know that this work isn't happening behind closed doors. It's worth repeating, our actions need to match our desire for reconciliation. We're not here today to pat ourselves on the back. Today is really just a critical milestone of the journey. I'll pass it back to the city manager to close.
Thank you, Rob. So what is next? First, each department team will continue to develop their action plans and begin the work on year one priorities. It's very important to me as city manager and to the leadership team that we want to see this framework put into action. And so that's why we're focusing on these action plans immediately. The city will host an annual gathering with community partners, Indigenous youth and elders. This will be an opportunity to check in with the Indigenous community members to talk about our collective successes or problems and where improvements in the relationship can be made. We want to keep ourselves honest in this, and we want to keep it very genuine. And we'll return to council in 2022 with an update on the progress. This framework represents the evolution of a long-standing relationship the City of Edmonton has with Indigenous peoples. Implementing what we see as an improved approach will take a united effort amongst our department level teams, the corporate steering committee, and our executive leadership team. And for those city employees who may be listening in, I want to emphasize that it's going to be the responsibility of every employee to fulfill the 4 roles and 7 commitments of this framework. And so we're going to be talking about what that means a lot here in the city. This is the beginning of a career-long journey for all of us as we continuously learn how to become better listeners, better connectors, advocates, and partners. We are pleased to present this framework for Council's review and are committed to the call for action and accountability that entails and the long journey we have ahead. We would be happy to take your questions. Hi.